Good morning, my friends. Welcome to our New Testament challenge. Today I'm going to be sharing with you some thoughts from the 11th chapter of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. He starts off with the first verse is actually kind of the last verse of the previous section, but he talks about, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. Now, a little thought there. As a pastor, this verse makes me nervous. Paul is basically saying, hey, look at me, do what I do. I appreciate what he's trying to do, but I also know my faults and my failures and my imperfections, and to tell someone, hey, look at what I'm doing, follow me, it's kind of scary. However, I also understand that for people who, it's always good to have a leader to look up to see faith in action, to see what Christ looks like, out and among us, to look at the hands and feet of Christ. That's what we are. And so wherever we are, there's always someone we look up to, and there's someone who's looking up to us. We've got to be careful about being the example. He then goes in and talks about head coverings. And really he's talking about men and women, talking about the difference between the two. And a lot of this is cultural. Talk about the head coverings. A woman ought to have her head covered. Man ought not to. What is difficult for us today is what to pick up out of this and what to leave behind, as far as cultural trappings, because there are some denominations and church traditions that the woman does have her head covered all the time, but for many of us they do not. There's some where a man comes in wearing a hat, and there are many that do not. And so he talks about that. How woman was taken from man, the rib, but then man becomes born from woman, his birth. And so there is a mutuality here that we would do well to remember. Another interesting little passage that oftentimes gets skipped over, verse 9, he says, but any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled disgraces her head. So there's an underlying assumption here that women were praying and prophesying in service. We hear later Paul says, hey, you need to be quiet, take it home and ask your husband. So, I think really we talk about that they're addressing different situations. Here, there's an assumption that women were speaking, that they were teaching or prophesying or praying, or they were in front. I think later on, it was more about disruption in the service itself. Kind of like, I've never been to a church where there wasn't at least some whispering going on from all sides and all ages. I know when I was growing up, we had a balcony, and so they had to send some adults up there to keep us in line as kids. Or it's either the balcony or the back of the church, so there's always conversations going on. And so the idea, what Paul was saying, y'all need to be quiet. This is important. But this passage assumes that women were praying and prophesying in the service. That's my reading of this. I've also read that the word prophesy here has been used, translated as preach also. Again, that's one of those, you make that choice. And so obviously there are some traditions that choose preach and some that use prophesy. But whatever it was, it talks about his focus is more on wearing your head covered than it was whether they should pray or prophesy in public. So kind of interesting. Then he talks about abuses at the Lord's Supper. Um, Now, the early church, and we hear this in Acts, obviously there were not church buildings. And so for many of the churches, there were house churches, small, intimate gatherings. And when they talked about the Lord's Supper, they talked about supper itself. And so they would eat together. Acts chapter 2 talks about they had everything in common. They gathered together and ate together. And so I think some of this kind of spilled over into the Lord's Supper, the sacrament itself, because there were people who would show up early and get started eating. There would be people who would come up and drink the wine, and some people, stuffed themselves, and others went hungry. Some people had nothing to drink, and some people got drunk. So Paul's saying, no, 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 that's not how it's supposed to be. Just yes, we know we're talking about bread and juice, but what it represents, we are partaking of the body and the blood of Christ. We are inviting him in. We are accepting his grace. And the idea of gorging yourself and getting drunk on that is just blasphemous, really, if we want to be honest there. And so he's just saying, just do the best you can, and treat each other the way you want to be treated. If you're hungry, eat at home, so that when you come together, it's about what we're doing together. So, interesting stuff. Hope that helps. Take care, and we will talk to you tomorrow.